The lamps in the hallway flicker, and the musty smell mingles with the dry breath of the night. There are places where even silence refuses shelter, because what lives there is not made of words, but of a damp and cold memory running down the spine of those who dare to be alone. Helena laughs at herself. She thinks it's silly to feel this tightness in her chest. But the buzzing of insects, the distant sound of water dripping into a rusty bucket, draw the invisible outline of something he observes behind the peeling walls. Mirrors avoid returning their own reflection, as if they wanted to protect those who look at it from some crooked truth. The skin does not hold everything it feels inside. A thin crack cuts the bathroom mirror, resembling a mouthless smile, and Helena runs her hand over her arm, trying to convince herself that everything is under control. But nothing seems to fit in on itself lately. The bones creak, and the skin itches, as if it wants to free itself from something that grows deep in the flesh. Messages on the cell phone accumulate. Questions, demands, appointments. She deletes the warnings without reading, repeats to herself that it's just bad days. But the feeling of having someone inside the house scratching at her bedroom door at 4 in the morning never let her sleep again. In the dim light, Helena remembers the childhood nights when her mother said that monsters only exist for those who feed them. Now she understands, but it's too late. The monster that inhabits her has no name, only nails that peel off her own skin. The more you try to forget, the more you notice small changes. Eyes that see too much, ears that pick up non-existent noises, flesh that doesn't stop throbbing. Helena wonders if she will ever return to normal, if there was any normal before everything tore up. Time drags the memories, but the body denounces. That itch does not go away. That crack does not close. In the bathtub, standing water reflects movements that do not correspond to what you feel. The blood pulses out of rhythm. The cloven mirror seems to know too much. Helena now understands why no one talks about their own cracks. They grow slowly, inside, until you can no longer pretend. When you look, you no longer recognize your own shadow and understand that perhaps living is enduring that which cannot be explained nor hidden forever. The darkness offers no answer, it only rests on the cut skin, waiting for the next flash. There are places where it's easier to get lost than to find your own name. Helena believed that isolation was a way to put the pieces of herself together, dispersed between long silences and days that persisted with no promise of change. When she decided her life needed a fresh start, the noisy streets of Baltimore were left behind, along with the echoes of ex-boyfriends, frustrated bosses, and friends who no longer knew what to say as they saw her growing farther away. The desire for some freedom led her to a small Pennsylvania town, Waynesboro, a spot lost between forests and low hills where time, the neighborhood said, seemed to run more slowly. The house was an old, lonely building, far from the city center. A sloping wooden fence demarcated the terrain, and on windy days it creaked in a way that resembled persistent crying. The garden was filled with tall weeds and dry leaves, and the attic held furniture covered with grayish sheets, remnants of other lives that had passed without a trace of happiness. Helena found there a chance to start over, or to forget. She didn't know for sure. In Baltimore, the expectation of success lurked in her like an unpaid debt, and each failure resounded like a dirty secret in conversations between acquaintances. In Waynesboro, among strange people and discreet neighbors, she imagined that she could hide everything that hurt her. Despite the thin air and the autumn scenery, with leafless trees casting angular shadows over the backyard, there was an oppressive stillness in those early days. The interior of the house was damp, with peeling wallpaper and a constant smell of stuff stored too much. Helena spent hours cleaning, in an attempt to eliminate that feeling of a place frozen in time. His motivations were simple: to find peace, to listen to the sound of his own heart without the weight of other people's looks, to sleep without nightmares. Helena, with her brown hair always tied up in a sloppy way and baggy clothes to circumvent the discomfort of existing, had marks of sleepless nights and deep dark circles under her face. She was always anxious, her head full of unanswered questions, the fear of not being enough accompanying her like a shadow since she was 12. He dreamed of writing, but he exchanged stories for to-do lists and bills to pay. When he abandoned his previous life, he sought a reason to get out of bed beyond his obligation, a path that was not an extension of the emptiness he felt at the end of each afternoon. The routine was interrupted by intense dreams, ideas that arose during the early hours. Instead of relief, she felt an emptiness taking up space between the walls of the room. Sometimes he wondered if loneliness was a fever or an open wound. Time in Waynesboro became a mirror in which his fears grew, multiplied with each unidentified noise. The neighbors spoke little. The nearest convenience store required a brisk walk along nearly deserted roads, lined with trees that rustled in the wind. The first signs of discomfort arrived before winter. Helena woke up one night to the sound of the window slamming, even though she was locked up. He imagined that the wind was seeping through old cracks, but he found the curtains still, the glass untouched. She felt an itch on her back, a thin line of burning, which she justified as an allergy. In the bathroom, he noticed that one of the mirrors looked crooked, but he didn't remember moving it. A metallic smell insisted on hanging over the room, even after cleaning. Every detail provoked a quiet uneasiness, but she refused to name. In the second week, she began to hear noises coming from the attic at night. A drag of something heavy, then what seemed like a low breath, muffled by the wooden floor. When she went up to check, the light flickered, and Helena felt watched by eyes that could not exist there. He found nothing, but the sense of presence hurt more than fear itself. The clock on the wall was minutes late every morning. The television, turned on by itself on static channels, squeaked like submerged voices. One night, while reading on the sofa, Helena noticed a rapid movement through the window. A dark figure, forgotten on the periphery of the vision, among the trees of the garden. The body seemed crooked, the limbs too long to be those of anyone known. He went out to the balcony to look, but all he saw was the fog, descending heavy, distorting the light from the distant streetlights. The silence returned, laden with unspoken promises. In the following days, strange marks appeared around the house. Deep scratches on the fencewoods, muddy footprints by the back door, thin fingers drawn with precision impossible for any local animal. Helena tried to ignore it, but during the night, the sound of fingernails scraping wood woke her up, and for a split second, she swore to feel the mattress sink next to her, as if the weight of a foreign body shared the dawn with her. Time there seemed suspended in expectation of something. The desire to start over merged with the suspicion that there are certain wounds that change the very matter of those who try to escape. Waynesboro was never a land of miracles, nor did Helena seek redemption. He just wanted to erase the traces of what he was. But in the dark corners of the old house, he realized that there are things that can't be locked outside. The skin itched, so did the memory. And among the trees, someone or something continued to watch, patiently, waiting for the next crack to make way for what has no name, no face, no feather. Night fell over Waynesboro with sickly slowness, and the house plunged into shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The wind thickened, knocking the trees against the windows, and Helena walked through rooms that insisted on returning their distorted reflection on any glass surface. The phone rang for no one. Whenever she answered, she only heard the muffled whisper of static as if someone breathed on the other side. The clock stopped at exactly 3 a.m, motionless hands marking a time that no longer belonged to her. The house, of robust construction, changed subtly every day. doors that threatened not to open anymore, floorboards creaking in rhythm in response to Helena's hesitant walk. The old smell became more persistent, and icy waves ran through the corridors without the windows being open. In the attic, objects were rearranged, heavy furniture discreetly moved while she slept, and an old armchair began to appear by the window, staring at the emptiness of the backyard. It didn't take long for Helena to start feeling looks where there were no people. The bathroom turned into a trap. Every time I turned off the light, I swore to perceive something behind the dark veil of the mirror. The ceiling creaked. Drips fell inside the walls. Closed doors opened by millimeters, a breeze coming out of nowhere. One night, he woke up with the marks of his own fingers etched into his arms, as if he wanted to protect himself from something invisible or prevent his own flesh from escaping. There was always an intermittent noise, a low drag, blending with the sound of his own footsteps. In the city market, the feeling of discomfort followed Helena like an odor that was difficult to scare away. He avoided contact, but began to pay attention to whispered voices, averted glances when he asked about the former owner of his house. Mr. Jenkins, the middle-aged clerk at the grocery store, made a point of answering only in short sentences, escaping her eyes as if he were staring at something he didn't intend to name. "That house should have been empty a long time ago," he once murmured with a tired expression, as if remembering an obligation never fulfilled. Helena tried to approach the elderly woman who was sweeping the porch in front of the drugstore. Mrs. Ruth, hair tied up and hands marked by time, looked at Helena with regret, refusing to hold her eyes when she mentioned oddities. "These old houses hold more than dust. Things are born and die fast here," he said, before retiring inside the door, leaving the street deserted. The following week, while arranging forgotten boxes in the attic, Helena found a pile of yellowed newspaper clippings, pages marked by blurred letters and faceless photographs. One news item drew attention: mysterious disappearance on Old Pine Road, author unknown, fruitless searches. There was no date, and the name of none of the missing was revealed completely, as if something had censored the story. Another cut spoke of anomalies in the ground, underground noises, reported by old residents. Helena felt the weight of the house, as if an extra layer of dust blocked her own breathing. Nights became impossible. Something was passing through. The corridor, shadows cut through the crack in the door, footsteps that stopped when she held her breath, cobwebs sprouted out of nowhere. One night, he woke up to the sound of claws dragging on the wood, coming from the living room. He stood up slowly, hearing his own blood hammer in his ears. The lobby was cold, and the metallic smell had returned stronger. In the dim light, for a second, Helena saw a silhouette bent in the corner, absurdly long legs, the skin pulled to the limit, like fabric about to tear. The eyes were not eyes, but dark wells, which absorbed all the rest of the light. As she stepped closer, the figure disappeared with a crack, leaving only the hollow sound echoing off the walls. At dawn, Helena found long footprints, a kind of deep cracks in the damp clay outside. He tried to photograph it, but when he looked at the phone's display, the image was always blurry, impossible to record. Shadows roamed the yard, too fast to be seen from the front. He tried to talk to the neighbors again, but found closed doors and phone calls that were not returned. Determined, she searched the local library for any record of the house. The librarian, Brian, seemed willing to help, but when he saw Helena's address, the smile disappeared. "This house once belonged to the Bishop family. They disappeared, all of them," was the most he said, before suggesting that he look for another city to live. And it used to be better for strangers. Helena could no longer distinguish what was memory from what was invention. The walls seemed closer and closer. Voices called her name in her sleep. Her hair began to fall in strands on the pillow. Purplish spots appeared on her skin. The mirror. now returned a tired face, cut by fissures that only she saw. Although he tried to rationalize the events, to attribute it all to stress, to loneliness, to the loneliness of a distant new life, something in his body resonated like an out-of-tune note. Even so, curiosity began to speak louder than fear. Immersed in the unknown, Helena felt the seams of her story unraveling, as if she were getting closer and closer to a secret that inhabits not the rooms of the house, but the thickness of her own skin. The days in Waynesboro followed a circular course for Helena, marked by sleepless nights and a growing restlessness that insisted on piercing the skin. Each strange new signal, each shadow cast at impossible angles, seemed to call her to the center of some ancient secret. The house, once a mute refuge, was now a pulsating organism breathing along with every anxious beat of his heart. The need for answers has become greater than fear. The morning she found a worn-out wooden box at the bottom of the attic, Helena knew she could no longer ignore the dark call of that place. When he opened it, he pulled out yellowed letters, papers with shaky signatures, and faded photos. Each object seemed to exude a particular cold, different from the wind that cut through the yard. There was there, among envelopes, a kind of diary, scribbled pages, short and confusing accounts. Words like ruin, rottenness, skin, rest were repeated throughout the leaves. Written in nervous handwriting, the phrases suggested that the previous inhabitant was waging an invisible struggle. In one of the letters, Helena recognized the name Bishop. A page in the diary read, "The house does not forget. What comes in here carries the burden, the hunger of the place. The cracks appear first. Afterwards there is no going back." Leafing through the photos, Helena noticed a sequence of what seemed to be family gatherings in the garden, all marked by rigid expressions, tense bodies, and in the background, a sinuous shadow crossing the flower beds, something far beyond the usual in a photograph of that time. In some images, children displayed scratches on their arms and necks, and adults covered parts of their faces as if trying to hide marks or deformities. Determined to understand the context, Helena rummaged through old newspapers in the library. Brian, the librarian, once again hesitated, but ended up showing a forgotten binder, kept at the insistence of the old families of the town. There were clippings of funeral announcements, followed by disconnected news, outbreaks of rare diseases, unexplained disappearances, reports of people seen walking barefoot in the early hours, scratching the walls of their own homes. Handwritten notes added much later read, "Back at Bishop House, no one talks about the famine. They can see right through us." Helena read about Samuel Bishop, the original owner, and his wife Clara, whose portraits were among the photos she had found. There was a footnote mentioning a tragedy. Family missing, only stains left on the walls, such as peeling skin. In the basement of the house, behind a loose panel, Helena discovered a piece of thin fabric, rigid by time, half translucent, with a texture that resembled a membrane more than ordinary cotton. Along with them were small glass jars with dark liquid. In some floated small strands of hair or nails. On the floor of that hidden corner, Helena found inscriptions impulsively scratched. "Under the skin, they come when we sleep. There is no end, only passage." As it progressed in its discoveries, the house intensified its attacks. Sounds of breaking bones echoed in the night, and the walls seemed to pulsate, expand, and contract like a large diseased lung. Helena saw figures crawling among the furniture, and sometimes felt invisible fingers pressing against the back of her neck or shoulders. Often, when she looked in the mirror, she noticed the skin on her face undulating, like a veil about to slip. In the hours of trembling, it felt like a cracked box on the verge of losing its edges, losing its sense. Once again, he sought out Ruth, the old woman from the drugstore, to ask about what he had read and seen. This time, the woman hesitated, but her gaze was different, as if at last she recognized something in Helena. "Don't you feel your skin tighten? Don't you hear your name whispered around the house? Everyone who crosses the threshold of it carries a piece of that which cannot be seen. It's not just a curse, girl. It's hunger. It always has been," he murmured. The suspicion of a personal connection could no longer be denied. Rummaging through her childhood, flashes would come back. Memories of unexplained scratches, lingering nightmares, a grandmother who always told her to avoid homes where time doesn't pass right. In the attic, Helena found an old notebook of her mother's, forgotten in a childhood box lost among the constant changes. There were notes about Waynesboro, letters to someone named Clara, advice to never go back to the skinning house. Helena realized with a knot in her chest that her family had been connected to that house for generations. The next night, the apparition became clearer. When he returned from the bathroom, he came across it crossing the corridor. Now he could distinguish the translucent skin, long claws, and the lowered head, emitting a liquid noise, like flesh being torn apart. The eyes, when the creature turned its face, were dry and sunken, and filled Helena with a primitive fear, as if her soul, and not just her body, were in danger. In the following hours, his skin began to show stains, and under the light, the same lines were drawn that he had seen in the inscriptions in the basement. It was as if the mystery of the house was not only ancient, but inherited, passed down from generation to generation, an insatiable hunger that now resided in it, lurking for a larger crack. Everything made sense, and at the same time escaped any logic. It was not enough to go through the past. Helena finally understood that she, more than any other presence, was the receptacle of all that was wrong and hungry in Bishop House. The nights were no different from the days for Helena. Time, like the walls of the house, now bowed to the will of something invisible. The silence was broken by gurgling noises, as if the house itself was digesting something inside its guts. The clock in the corridor rang by itself, sometimes moving forward, sometimes backward, like a heart that beats out of rhythm. The metallic smell served as an alarm. It often appeared before the most acute episodes. It was always preceded by the shaking of the ground, as if something crawled under the planks, trying to cross from the inside out. Helena no longer slept. She tried to close her eyes, but her heavy eyelids pulsed, and behind them paraded images of flesh cracking bones, baby teeth falling out again and again in the same dream. The fear became physical, grinding her nerves, leaving a feeling of constant flaying. Some mornings, objects were rearranged, pictures reversed, furniture moved around, glass bottles filled with small, translucent pieces that looked, she acknowledged in horror, like nail chips or fragments of skin. With each new day, Helena found herself weaker. The mirror began to show another person, the face covered with blemishes, dark lines drawing secret maps under the skin, sunken and restless eyes. Sometimes, as I washed my face, I felt the tips of my fingers go through a layer that was not just skin, as if touching a porous and fluffy membrane. At other times, the water oozed black paint, dissolving something from the inside out. The voices of the house became clear. They called his name, repeated phrases from the bishop's diaries, invaded his head with sounds of distorted laughter and chilling childish melodies. The walls groaned as if they hurt along with her. The house breathed, swallowed Helena day after day. In a dawn full of thunder, Helena heard footsteps coming from the attic, like claws scraping the boards. He took a flashlight and climbed up, unable to resist the inescapable call. When he opened the door, he found the attic filled with spectral figures, shadows composed of familiar and unfamiliar faces, mouths open in deafening silence. In the center, placed on the floor, was the wooden box. She opened up on her own before. Helena now revealing a larger and more stiffened tissue, pulsating a faint red light, like a living organ torn from someone. When she touched the fabric, she was thrown in a sequence of visions. The Bishop family surrounded by hunger in the house, bodies peeling, souls draining on the floor, children screaming for a mother who had already lost face to the entity. He also saw his mother, a young woman, running away in a hurry, leaving the little girl that Helena had laid in a crib, trembling. At that moment, he realized his connection with the house came from long before, and there was no chance of escaping. The hunger it served. Helena staggered downstairs, feeling the house twist its own architecture around her. The corridor shrank, the room spun on a dense carousel of shadows running across the ceilings and walls. On the surfaces, reflections showed scenes that did not exist. She herself sat in other rooms, always with her eyes deeply black, looking at herself. Doubt tore through his sanity. Now the disturbances did not come only from outside. Phone calls woke her up with brief sleeps, but when she answered, she heard her own voice repeating phrases from the diary, like a temporal echo. He began to question whether his thoughts were really his own, or seeded by the entity's voice. He vomited fragments of skin through the sink, saw strands of hair curling around the doorknobs. Shallow cuts ran through his body without explanation. And when he rubbed, he felt no pain, only a growing numbness. One afternoon, a sudden paralysis took over her body in front of the bathroom mirror. He saw behind him, reflected, the misshapen presence. The creature, Bishop, increasingly real and closer, smiling in an impossible way, with multiplied teeth and dry eyes that threatened to suck it into the glass. He fled from the bathroom, but the house lost its logic. Doors led to rooms that did not exist. Stairs were repeated in a spiral. Windows showed the garden at different times of the day, never in the present. With each attempt to escape, he felt his limbs get heavier, and his skin, sensitive to the touch, seemed to want to tear and let go of his body. Her own voice began to crack. When she tried to scream, she heard herself muffled, as if she was submerged. The outside world became more distant. He sought help, but no one answered. No one listened. The neighbors, when they saw her through the window, immediately closed the curtains. The phone showed calls from non-existent numbers. The house now was not only the stage of presence, it was the living being itself that kept her imprisoned there, feeding on her, leaving marks on her flesh while stealing her lucidity. Sitting on the living room floor, Helena felt the cracks. In her skin open, small cracks from which a viscous substance flowed. She daydreamed of having been someone else, a life in which there was no bishop house, no lineage, no famine. But there, under the skin, I felt the contagion growing, the bones vibrating as if tuned by another frequency. With each breath, the presence became more palpable. The wall between reality and delirium collapsed for good, and finally she understood. It no longer mattered whether what she saw was reality or hallucination. She now belonged to the realm of the house, where being sane was just one more danger, and the ancestral hunger would continue to hover, even if, when she awoke, everything seemed just a poorly explained dream. The final collapse began quietly, with an almost inaudible dripping sound, as if Helena's sweat and blood evaporated under the constant tension. There were moans coming from the walls, brief laughter in the corners of the room, and Helena's own voice being returned to her in sarcastic murmurs. She no longer distinguished exactly where her body ended and the house began. On the verge of exhaustion, he developed a routine of surviving minute by minute, avoiding the rooms where the shadows were thicker, ignoring the parts of the mirror that insisted on showing his transformed face. The house darkened every day, the cracks closed by webs, and time glued to the ceiling like a layer of sticky dust. Each step she took seemed to find a buried piece of memory along the way. her childhood drenched in fear of the dark, the choked, crying under the blankets, the recurring terror of maternal abandonment. The entity now not only walked at night, but whispered directly in Helena's ear, using her voice, and sometimes her mother's, oscillating between promises of help and sadistic threats about the eternal hunger of the house. It was almost impossible to discern the truth when reason itself was already eroded by the feverish and distorted scenario. However, there were brief sparks of lucidity. One night, when she felt the skin tear under her fingernails, the fissures, expelling not only blood, but something black and dense, Helena realized that physical pain was an anchor. For an instant, the intense sensation drove away the mental torpor, revealing an abrupt clarity. Clinging to his own suffering, he forced himself to breathe, searching within himself for some spark of ancestral resistance, that same fury that survived in the old diaries and that had somehow kept others alive long enough to tell the tale. He remembered the words scribbled in the secret compartment of the basement. The struggle takes place under the skin. The entity feeds on fear, guilt, and resignation. The confrontation then became intimate and inevitable. The corridors pressed around Helena as she advanced, each heartbeat more marked, the sweat mixing with the substance that leaked from the cracks that decorated her body. Sometimes he did not know whether to really advance or to wander an inner labyrinth created by his own traumas and the insatiable compulsion of the house. Voices multiplied, mocked, questioned the courage he had never had in childhood. "You never resisted," they shouted. He ran away from everything, from his mother, from the past, from himself. Each sentence sounded like the whining of her weaker self, but Helena, trembling, tried to anchor herself in the instant, refusing to be just a victim. Suddenly, a force pushed her against the basement door. The icy wood seemed to try to absorb it. With the instinct of pure despair, Helena held the flashlight trembling, staggered down the steps, and perceived, between light and darkness, the contours of the creature. Translucent skin, jaw open, dry eyes, full of hunger. The space seemed to warp, projecting Helena simultaneously to the present and to scenes from her past. A childhood marked by scares, an absent father, distorted memories of abandonment. The creature's claws were not only directed at the flesh, seemed to scratch the boundaries of the mind. Helena felt the panic grow, like an old familiar wave, paralyzing muscles before suddenly breaking her in sudden fury. She vividly recalled a distant night as a child when she hid in the attic because she believed she could face the dark on her own. No one came looking for her. He cried, but survived. He understood in that second. He had always survived his worst nightmares, even without witnesses. The house accelerated the terror, multiplied the figures, made the walls throb like a choleric heart. But now Helena, her face bathed in sweat, fixed her gaze in the eyes of the entity. "I'm not just fear, not anymore," she whispered, even as her voice echoed and dissolved into distortions. The clash became physical. The creature charged, piercing Helena with invisible tentacles and claws. Helena rolled under the basement panel, felt her skin explode in pain. But between blood and dread, she used her own anger and what was left of lucidity. He tore part of the pulsating fabric of the box, forcing himself to touch where everything throbbed and suppurated a sickly heat. For a moment, he felt as if his whole life, the abandonment, the emptiness, the cursed inheritance, was sucked into the fabric. It was as if he surrendered everything, all his fears and frustrations, in a desperate act. The basement shook. The voices reached their peak, and the bishop creature briefly extinguished, dissolving into the walls and trickling down to the foundations, as a bad dream dissipates with the sunrise. Panting and bloodied, Helena fell to her knees. He knew that this battle was not the end. The house shook, adjusting to the new balance, and the ancestral hunger still echoed under the boards. But somehow, Helena had regained a small portion of herself, feeling, for the first time in weeks, a sad lightness, almost hope. She knew that the fight for survival had changed. It was not enough to run away from the horror. She would need to reinvent herself and decide what she would do with what had survived inside her, still remaining. Until the next night. The night seemed denser, sticking to the walls, to the floor, to Helena's own blood. The air in the house was saturated, impregnated by a stronger smell of iron and wet earth, as if the outside world had ceased to exist. The house closed around her, breathing like a lurking animal. The ceiling seemed lower, the walls closer, the basement pulsating under his feet. Helena felt the beating of her own heart echo through the structure of the place, mixing with the rhythm of another living thing, something dormant for years, and now waking up to desire what was rightfully theirs. The anchor of pain on her body, the cracks scattered in her skin, and the scars that formed shaky maps on her arms were no longer enough to keep her alert or separate reality from delirium. The near peace won after the last confrontation was rapidly eroding, replaced by an urgent certainty. This would be his last night, his last chance. The whispers started timidly, but grew like a storm, dragging names, distorted memories, excerpts from old diaries, childish cries of someone lost, and promises that this time the sacrifice would be complete. Helena advanced down the corridor, now a dark tube that undulated with each step, and tried not to go crazy in front of the pictures that showed altered faces, glass eyes staring at her. He felt a force weighing on his shoulders, as if all the bishops and the ghosts of the former residents crowded inside the flesh, propelling it towards the basement. She descended the steps as if diving into an icy lake, aware that there was no return. The heat from the ground rose to his legs, an energy that spread and fluttered under his feet. The basement was darker than ever, and in the center, among wood chips and dust, pulsating fabric illuminated the floor with reddish light. From that place, the bishop creature emerged whole, a mutated form of shadows and frayed flesh, with multiple dry eyes, hungry mouths, claws piercing the air toward Helena's exposed chest. Each movement of the entity was accompanied by quick images, fragments of pain, memories of his childhood, the look of the lost mother saying, "You are the chosen one," the echo of all the losses and abandonments. It was as if the house had kept every failure, every shame, to now use against it. Helena felt her legs weaken, her breathing failing, an ancestral panic threatening to swallow her. But she realized, in that vertigo, that all the horror was only powerful because there was still something in her trying to survive, something that the entity did not know. The silent insurrection, the refusal to be devoured, the instinct to retain a tiny spark of self-will. By leaps and bounds, she stood up, sacrilegious and determined, and faced the creature with all the hatred she had felt for herself over the years, all the sorrow of being her own prison, all the sadness never digested. He screamed, and the sound spread like a wave, shaking the shadows. For a moment, all the figures in the basement hesitated. The entity ranted, mixing old voices and Helena's, trying to confuse her, to extract from her the last drop of sanity. Helena, however, remembered what the diaries and the box taught. The bond of the house was blood and choice. She finally understood that in order to break the cycle, she would have to pay the price, which was not just to survive or fight, but to give something of herself that she would never recover. With tears flowing, he approached the box, feeling the fabric throbbing, and opened a larger crack in his own hand, spilling blood on the object. With each red drop, she felt the most precious memories, a hug, a childhood smile, the hope of starting over, being sucked in. It was the inevitable sacrifice, surrendering not only fear, but one's own joys, the desire to belong somewhere. The entity screamed, distorting all of space and exploding in a storm of voices. The claws pierced Helena's chest without touching flesh. It was his essence that was torn. A flash of purity, brief and cutting, crossed the basement when, in a last act of will, Helena pushed into the box all the images of who she had been, all the old dreams, accepting that she might never again be able to recognize herself. In front of the mirror, the ground shook, walls bled, the ceiling broke in tears. The bishop entity plummeted on her, shattering into spirals of shadow and dust, vacillating between wanting to absorb her and being destroyed by her surrender. Helena felt emptiness take over everything, an absence of pain, of will, of identity. The silence came soon after, dense, absolute. When she opened her eyes, she was alone. The basement seemed larger, empty, and cold. The fabric, mute, lying beside him, soaked in blood and tears. The house, for the first time, stopped breathing. The noises stopped. Helena dragged herself to the stairs, taking with her the certainty of having won, but in a bitter victory, of someone who leaves behind pieces of herself. Above it, the house was bathed in a pale light, and the air was at last only heavy, not threatening. But inside Helena, a new absence pulsated. The price of the decision was too high. The emotional impact ran through her like the claws of the entity, the realization that it would never be the same again, that a bright and dreamy part would never return. However, there was acceptance. It was made of its own scars, the horrors faced, and the emptiness left by everything it gave to survive. Outside, the night seemed less hostile, but the shadow of the house was forever etched in his flesh and in his dreams, a sharp reminder of what it means to win when the price is to leave oneself behind. The silence that fell over the house after the confrontation was total. Helena slowly climbed the steps of the basement, her body tired and the dried blood clinging to her skin like a second breastplate, her trembling fingers tracking the rough surface of the wall. Each step was a small victory against the weight of the emptiness installed within him. A shy amber light streamed through the window, revealing dust particles dancing in the still air. Nothing else seemed to pulse, scream, or obsess the room. The stillness had the density of a tombstone. She was alive, but what had survived inside her was something unrecognizable. The house, in a way, seemed emptied of its terrors, but there was a strange nostalgia and a cruel absence where hunger and threat had once dwelt. Helena walked through the rooms, staring at every crack, every chipped mirror, every creaking door, as if looking for a farewell. She searched in the echo of her own steps for some trace of what she was, trying to feel gratitude for having faced the endless night, but finding only the certainty of being marked forever. Her bloody hand throbbed, and when she touched the furniture, she felt an unprecedented distance from the world. She was now a foreigner, not only in the house, but in herself. For a few days, he wandered there, rearranging small objects, trying to wash the dried blood from his back, facing his reflections and exploring the devastated garden. There were no more lurking figures or distant screams, but the scar on his hand seemed to always ignite at dusk. On every corner, there seemed to be a residual whisper, a mute promise that, even defeated, the hunger of the house would never be completely extinguished. In the supermarket, the old ladies looked at her with more trepidation than before, as if they saw in her something that belonged neither to the living nor to the dead. One night, Helena tried to sleep soundly. The dream came thick and dark as home in the worst of times. She walked through corridors that stretched forever, doors opening by themselves, familiar voices whispering her name, the feeling of being pulled into her own scars. When she woke up, she felt the tears wetting her pillow, and knew as she looked at the diffuse shadows around the room that the quiet nights had died. As much as the horror of the house was silent, its echo would continue under the skin, ready to revive itself at the slightest carelessness. As the weeks passed, Helena organized the essentials, packed belongings, and finally closed the sealed windows. He rented a small room in another city, sought psychological care, but was never able to rationally explain what had happened. When asked, she masked memories with common words: an accident, a fright, a bad feeling, never mentioning the voices that still visited her in the silence or the relentless itch under the new scars. Doctors commented on deep trauma, post-traumatic stress, but nothing could be said about the emptiness that throbbed where there was once hope. The house was left behind, motionless, but not forgotten. Messages began to come in from a new family moving in. Helena, restless, sought news, peering from afar. One day, he mistakenly received a letter addressed to a new tenant. The paper was stained a rusty hue and exuded a familiar ochre perfume. In it, few words. "I hear noises in the attic. Okay? Did it happen to you too?" The cold alert ran through her body, raising the hairs on the back of her neck. The cycle had started again. It was impossible to know if I should warn, or if everything was already sealed. From the first step, someone took inside the house. Each night, sleep brought back the strange sensation of falling into the void, waking up with his body sweating and his chest suffocated by something that was not just a memory, but a physical permanence. He looked at the scar on his hand, sometimes, still bleeding subtly, and marveled at the way his body had assimilated a piece of darkness. She was not just a survivor. She carried within her a fragment of what she faced. A residual hunger, a propensity for silence, the feeling that something is always missing, even surrounded by normal life. The new city seemed brighter, the people simpler and more accessible, but Helena watched everything from a distance, perpetually alert to the smell of mold or the creaking of a door closing by itself. She told herself that everything was fine, that she had ended the cycle. But at night, alone, she heard an almost imperceptible noise inside her mind, an invitation to return, to better examine the cracks of the past. One day, he entered an antique store and came across a familiar object, a small, cracked painting with a distorted image, just like the one left on the wall of the house. The salesman smiled, asking if he was interested. Helena hesitated, feeling her heart racing, and retreated. Vowing never to return, time went on, but inside her restlessness was brewing. The void opened by sacrifice was never filled. It only gave way to a new type of survival, where peace was always precarious and fear never completely disappeared. In a note left in the kitchen, she wrote to herself, "What tears us inside never leaves us, but also transforms us." As she closed the bedroom door one late afternoon, she felt a chill, a whisper coming from the crack under the window. When he put his ear there, he only heard, "I'm still hungry." She walked away, determined to continue living, but deep down she already knew, certain horrors never end, they only change their skin. And as long as they continued to seek shelter in other houses, other hearts, the cycle would never close completely. If you enjoyed this chilling story and want to receive more content full of mystery, subscribe now to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any releases. By being part of our community, you can stay on top of the news, participate in the most sinister discussions, and even help create a space where no one has to face the unknown alone. So don't waste time. Click there.